You know what's strange? An entire generation was told they were special. You were told to aim higher, study harder, get the degree, push further than anyone before you. And somehow, you became the first generation projected to be worse off than your parents. Pause for a second. How does that even happen? Because this isn't about laziness. It's not about avocado toast. It's about what happens to your mind when the promise you grew up with slowly stops matching reality. If you were born between 1981 and 1996, you were raised inside a very specific story. The 90s felt optimistic. Technology was booming. College enrollment was rising. Every adult around you repeated the same formula. Prepare well enough, and the future will reward you. College equals safety. Ambition equals maturity. Achievement equals identity. And you believed it. Of course you did. The equation felt simple. Effort equals outcome. Work hard, get the degree, build the resume, climb steadily. Stability will follow. It worked before. Why wouldn't it work for you? But then adulthood showed up, and the landscape looked different. College prices exploded. Entry-level jobs wanted experience you couldn't possibly have yet. Housing costs climbed faster than wages, and companies quietly shifted the rules. Pensions disappeared. Full-time became contract. Layoffs became normal. Nothing collapsed overnight. It just shifted enough to make you doubt the ground beneath you. And here's where it gets interesting. When you believe success comes from effort and stability doesn't arrive, you don't immediately blame the system. You blame yourself. So what did millennials do? They didn't quit. They optimized. More certifications, more degrees, side hustles, new skills, LinkedIn rebrands. You consumed mindset content. You watched psychology videos. You tried to figure out why millennials think this way. From the outside, it looked ambitious. From the inside, it felt like survival. Now layer something else on top. You didn't just grow up during economic shifts. You grew up online. Your identity formed in public. Promotions, relationships, relocations, house purchases. Things that used to be private became measurable, comparable, algorithmic. And once comparison becomes constant, achievement stops feeling personal. It becomes relative. It becomes competitive. It becomes visible. And your nervous system adapts. Not with collapse, with vigilance. Low-grade, constant alertness. Always scanning, always adjusting. You can be productive and still exhausted. Successful and still anxious. Self-aware and still overwhelmed. That contradiction? That's not weakness. That's adaptation. Millennials normalized therapy. They made anxiety and depression discussable. They brought emotional intelligence into mainstream culture. But awareness doesn't remove pressure. It just makes you more conscious of it. And here's the real question. What happens when resilience stops being temporary and becomes permanent? What happens when just push through becomes a lifestyle? That's where burnout lives. Not in laziness, not in fragility, in structure, in conditions, in a system that changed faster than the promise did. And once you see that, you realize this was never about job hopping. It was never about toast. It was about how you learn to think, how you learn to adapt, how millennial psychology reflects the environment you matured inside. And that story? It goes much deeper than most people are willing to admit. But then the economic ground shifted, and no one really prepared you for that. You stepped forward, ready to follow the promised path, and suddenly, college costs nearly 10 times what it once did. Entry-level jobs expect 5 years of experience, and instead of security, you're handed $60,000 in debt and pushed into a gig economy where you're labeled an independent contractor with no safety net. But then the economic ground shifted, and no one really prepared you for that. You stepped forward, ready to follow the promised path, and suddenly, college cost nearly 10 times what it once did. Entry-level jobs expect 5 years of experience, and instead of security, you're handed $60,000 in debt and pushed into a gig economy where you're labeled an independent contractor with no safety net. There's actually a psychological term for that moment, when reality collides with the beliefs you built your life around. It's called schema disruption. And when that rupture hits an entire generation, you don't just get discouraged people. You get a deep shift in how they relate to institutions, to authority, to the very idea of a stable future. That's why you're often described as hopeful and hardened at the same time. You still believe fairness should exist, you just don't trust that it will. That's not bitterness, that's pattern recognition shaped by experience. And when it comes to work, you've been criticized endlessly for job hopping, for not being loyal enough. But pause for a second. What's underneath that criticism? Corporate America rewrote the rules long before you showed up. Pensions faded out, secure full-time roles turned into contracts, mass layoffs became strategy. You didn't invent disloyalty, you adapted. You adapted to a system that quietly withdrew its promise. That's not instability. That's a rational response to an environment that treats people as interchangeable. And here's something people don't talk about enough. You're also one of the most educated and most diverse generations this country has ever seen. When people describe you, they start with early internet culture, because you were the first to grow up alongside the internet as it was forming, and that shapes you. You question information, because you've seen how easily narratives shift depending on who controls the platform. So when you challenge systems, you're labeled entitled or difficult. But when critical thinking hits institutions that were never built to be examined, tension is inevitable. The mental health conversation looks different for you. You normalized therapy. You made anxiety and depression discussable. You reframed them as real struggles instead of character flaws. That's powerful. Except you're doing it while living under heavier pressure than previous generations, carrying student debt that once would have seemed impossible, facing housing costs that have soared past wage growth, working inside an economy where insecurity is built into the structure. So now you exist in this strange space, more emotionally aware, more mentally exhausted at the same time. And let's pause on the future for a moment, because you're also the generation watching environmental decline unfold in real time while being told you're responsible for fixing it, even though you hold less institutional power and fewer financial resources. Think about that. That creates a quiet layer of existential fear mixed with helplessness. Climate anxiety isn't abstract anymore. It's something you actually feel. So what you're looking at is a generation shaped by relentless expectations, financial instability, constant performance pressure, delayed milestones, and a front-row seat to multiple overlapping crises, all at once. And then society looks at you and says, "Why are you anxious? Why don't you just buy a house?" But when you step back and honestly review what you've experienced, your reaction isn't mysterious. You're responding exactly how a human responds when the foundation shifts beneath them and the map they were handed no longer matches the terrain. If this feels personal, subscribe. And if you want to support these deeper conversations, tap the join button and become a member. I truly appreciate your support.